Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. I think everybody's registered now, so we're ready to begin. For those of you who are new to our webinars, we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. So you should be able to see on the right hand side of your screen a control panel where you have the option to enter questions or comments throughout the webinar that we should be able to receive and pick up in our discussion sessions. You can also raise your hand by clicking on the icon with the hand on it to let us know that you're having any technical problems. We'll try to resolve those where we can. If we can't, don't worry, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website to download. Our website is www.dartington.org.uk. So my name is Sarah Blower. I am a researcher at the Social Research Unit, and I'm joined today by my colleague Victoria Baker. This is the fourth webinar in a series of 6 for Realising Ambition. It's on defining intervention activities, and you can see there on the screen that we've already done 3 webinars: developing intervention manuals, serving the right people, and developing a logic model. You can access those webinars on our website. The webinar today is structured into 4 different parts. So in the first, Vic will walk through what we mean by intervention activities. Then we'll have time for a short discussion where we'll try to address any questions that you've submitted through your control panel. Any that we can't pick up, we'll either take to the next discussion at the end of the webinar, or we'll collate them into a frequently asked questions document and circulate that at a later date. In the second part of the webinar, I'll take you through more of a how-to in how to specify intervention activities, and we'll have, again, some more time at the end for questions and answers. So I will hand you over to my colleague Victoria for the first section of the webinar.
Okay, so part 1, what are intervention activities? There are lots of high quality evaluations looking at how much impact different interventions have on children's lives. We know that interventions that succeed in improving child wellbeing are specific about whom they are trying to reach, what they are trying to achieve, and the rationale or logic model underpinning the intervention. But successful interventions are also specific about what they do, and this is the focus of today's webinar. It can actually be surprisingly difficult to establish what an intervention actually does. The people who are most familiar with an intervention tend to know intuitively what it does, but they often struggle to explain it simply to other people. This isn't necessarily a problem for small local interventions, although when you look closer, it is actually common to find that different staff actually have different understandings of what they are providing. However, for developers looking to replicate their intervention, clarity about what we call intervention activities is essential. Now, it's even more important to be clear about what the intervention does if the intervention is known to be successful. But why is this? Well, because we need to know what it was that actually made it successful in the first place, and only then can we do it again in the hopes of achieving the same results. So let's start with something none of us particularly enjoy, visit to the dentist. So what happens when you visit the dentist? How would you describe it? It could involve all manner of things, but a typical visit might look something like this. So we say look here because if you describe it well, it should be possible to visualise the experience. You visit the dentist surgery for a one-to-one appointment with the dentist. He or she spends about an hour giving you a filling and then a leaflet on how to brush your teeth properly. The receptionist makes an appointment for 6 months' time. Now, of course, this description is a simplification. The treatment needs to be done in a particular way and with a certain level of skill. But even from this short summary, we have a good sense of what, in essence, the intervention comprises. We know the setting, the dentist surgery, and the provider, the dentist, and also the mode of delivery, which is one-to-one. We also know the content of the intervention, some treatment and information and advice. We also know how long this takes and how often it happens, so the duration and the frequency. If we take an example more closely aligned with our area of work, with children and families, it isn't uncommon for a practitioner to say that they have provided a family with some support. But what does support really mean here? It could refer to various things: a parenting group, one-to-one mentoring, help with domestic chores, even taking children to an activity like a youth club, a play group, or practical help for a child with a disability, and so on and so forth. When we describe something simply as family support, this doesn't really tell us anything about the content of the support, where it's provided, for how long, how often, or in what format. When we're seeking to develop and replicate interventions, we need to be crystal clear about just what the intervention is or does. There should be no room for ambiguity. So, to link this to the webinar on logic models, what we're interested in here is specifying in some detail the nature of the activities in the logic model. You may have identified the risk factors you are seeking to address. So on the slide, you can see the risk factors are in red, and they're overcrowded housing, parental depression, inconsistent parenting, and antisocial peer network. But you actually need to unpack the activities you're putting into a place to address those risk factors. For example, you may be offering housing support to reduce the overcrowded accommodation. But what does that housing support really consist of? Or you may have identified protective factors you're seeking to enhance. Perhaps you're running group meetings to build social supports. But what actually happens in those meetings? How often are they? Where and who leads them? One of the hardest things to do is to set out the content of an intervention. In other words, what actually gets delivered or imparted in the transaction between the person delivering the intervention and the person receiving it, so between the provider and the user. A helpful way of thinking about this transaction is actually in terms of technologies. So usually we think about technology in terms of electronic equipment or machinery, but in essence, if you break it down, technology refers to using tools or techniques to solve a problem or achieve a goal. So for example, to solve a communication problem, you might use a computer to send an email. Using computers to send emails is therefore a technology, the same as using a knife to cut food or striking a match to make a fire. So what are the technologies we use in seeking to improve outcomes for children? Let's look at a few examples now. Giving information is telling someone something that will hopefully be of use to them. You are aiming to give them a better understanding of a situation or problem and tell them how they can help themselves or where they can obtain help. Advice goes a step further by encouraging or directing people to take a particular course of action. So information would be smoking causes cancer, whereas advice might be you should stop smoking. Befriending involves establishing a trusting relationship with someone, gradually getting to know them, and eventually offering practical and emotional help. However, mentoring goes further. It involves working alongside someone and helping them with a particular course of action through a mixture of regular feedback and, as a role model, demonstrating a desirable behaviour. But some technologies in our field are easier to pin down than others. Giving money is one example of this. Offering material goods is another. Many organisations help families by providing food, beds, heaters, carpets, and so on. We won't go into every type of technology here because most are pretty self-evident, but treatment, therapy, training, advocacy, the list goes on. The point is that these are all discrete tools for achieving a goal, and we have them at our disposal. While these technologies can be used in isolation, it's more common for them to be used in combination. There are interventions that just involve providing information, but it's more common for it to be combined with advice and perhaps advocacy, or for treatment to be accompanied with information and advice, like our hypothetical visit to the dentist, for example. Next, it helps to think about who actually provides your intervention. You might make a simple distinction between a professional and a volunteer, but you could also break professional down further. So, for instance, are you talking about a social worker, a teacher, a doctor, youth justice worker, or psychologist? Or is it a combination of several of them? Perhaps a teacher delivers class lessons and a psychologist runs after-school sessions within the same intervention. It's also necessary to indicate how long the intervention lasts, and it helps to break this down into 3 parts. So first, how long is the intervention from start to finish? So, for example, a parenting course might start in September and end in December and last for 12 weeks. And secondly, how long are the components of the intervention? Continuing the parenting group example, the sessions might typically last for around 2 hours. And third, how often do the components of the intervention take place? So another way of putting this is to ask how intensive the intervention is. So in the case of the parenting intervention, it would probably be weekly. Of course, interventions can vary widely in how long they last, how long sessions are, and how often those sessions happen, because one size does not necessarily fit all. Some are very brief and can even be one-offs. So 1 2-hour session, for example. Others can last for years. A school-based social emotional curriculum might run throughout every year of primary school, taking a child from the age of 4 right up until they're 11. And there can also be variation in other respects. The same intervention might have some elements that last days and other elements that last weeks. A mentoring program, for instance, might involve an initial 1-week residential element, followed by weekly one-to-one sessions over several months, involving a volunteer and a young person. Equally, an intervention may offer flexibility on the timing. So, for example, you might decide to increase or reduce the number of sessions a young person receives in response to their needs. Interventions may also need to be flexible to fit the context they're delivered in. So, for example, within a school-based intervention, teachers may be left to decide whether material is delivered in one lesson or spread across several lessons. Okay, so what about location or setting? So these days, interventions can happen almost anywhere. Many still do take place in institutional settings, such as schools, clinics, or hospitals, but there are many other settings too. Youth activities often happen wherever the young person likes to hang out. There are also a host of non-statutory neighbourhood facilities such as leisure centres, community centres and church halls. There are also specially designed facilities for young people such as outward bound centres. And of course, some interventions actually take place in the service user's own home. Again, interventions often take place in a combination of these settings. A residential week might take place in an outward bound centre, followed by mentoring sessions in the park, cafes, shopping centre, football ground, and so on. An intervention to address a young person's drug misuse through intensive therapy might involve family sessions in the family home, but also one-to-one appointments at a clinic. So lastly, it's necessary to spell out what we call the medium of delivery. So in other words, how the intervention is delivered. The most common media are groups, one-to-one sessions, or increasingly via the internet. To give examples, parenting courses or social emotional curricula generally take place in group settings. The first in somewhere like a children's centre, and the second in classrooms. Counselling is usually on a one-to-one basis, as is mentoring. Some newer interventions, though, require the recipient to sit in front of the computer and work through a series of exercises. And again, unsurprisingly, it is common for there to be some mixing and matching in this. Some interventions involve one medium of delivery only, but many involve several, so group meetings supplemented by one-to-one sessions, for example. So, we've broken interventions down into several dimensions or components, these being content or technologies, provider, length, setting, and medium of delivery. Now, we are conscious that breaking things down like this can easily seem very sterile. Just like describing the anatomy of a hug, it rather sells the experience and meaning a bit short. There is lots that isn't captured, the importance of a warm, empathetic relationship between provider and user, for example, or the freedom to improvise depending on a user's needs. But we can say more about this later. For now, the point is that when you put the component parts together, you can begin to get a sense of what the intervention is. You can visualise it. You can see its beginning and its end, its structure and its shape. So let's take a hypothetical parenting programme. It involves a mixture of providing information and advice, training parents in skills such as how to praise children, how to play with them, and also how to discipline them and deal with tantrums. It's typically delivered by a trained psychologist and involves 2 hours every week for 2 weeks. It usually involves a group of about 12 parents and takes place in a children's centre. Or take a mentoring programme. The young person is befriended by a trained volunteer who provides mentoring and advocacy. It lasts for up to a year depending on the young person's needs and requires that meetings take place at least every other week. These meetings can happen in any suitable community setting. Now, even with these relatively short descriptions, it's possible to visualise the interventions and get a good sense of what they consist of. Historically, both would probably have come under the umbrella heading of support, but now they have been unpacked. Of course, there is lots more to flesh out here, but we'll talk about how to do this in the next section with Sarah after the discussion. So we can move on to some questions now.
Okay, thanks Vic, it's Sarah here. So I've been collating your questions as we've been going through and listening to Vic's presentation. So I'm just going to pose a series of those to Vicky now. So the first one, Vic, is our intervention has multiple components. Do we need to specify them all, as not all participants will receive all the activities?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the short answer is that yes, you do need to specify all of the activities, even if it is multiple component interventions and with flexible parts. It's important that all practitioners are aware of the full range of activities available and also any eligibility criteria that there might be. So when or with whom activities are and are not suitable. So this needs to be clearly specified in your manual. And it's also important to state with which components are core to your intervention. So they need to be kept irrespective of the participant and the context. And then those which are a bit more flexible. So those surface elements that can be changed and can be added in and out. You need to specify all of them and duration and when not to carry out those activities.
Great, okay, so the second question we have is, how do we specify intervention activities when our practitioners use a more common sense approach to programme delivery?
Okay, so firstly, it's important to say here that what's common sense to one person, it might not actually be common sense to another. So it's always really important with intervention to be really clear about what's being delivered, even if it seems as if a lot of those aspects are common sense. So there's always activities when you unpick it and that form the basis of an intervention. Even if there is a great deal of flexibility there. So, for example, if you take a mentoring relationship, although the mentors may not follow a strict set of activities, they may actually base their approach on certain models, such as modelling good behaviour, but using real life examples kind of to make it a bit more realistic for the young person. Also, within mentoring, they might get the young person to take part in leisure activities, and that is a component in itself, or facilitating between young person and certain community services. So all this really needs to be detailed and listed out. And all these activities and all these components and models, they need to be detailed in your manual. So it might be also useful as well to record how often certain activities take place. So which ones are more common, which ones are less common, how long they take, and when they aren't used. And also remember that when you've got activities highly sort of specified in your manual, it makes training new practitioners a lot easier because you've got it all laid out. Because as I said, what is common sense to one person might not be common sense to another. So having that detailed fully in your manual is really what you want to do there. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Great, okay, and I think we've got time for one more quick question. So, can we get any support to help us describe the detail of our intervention activities? I guess that's from us, from SIU.
Okay, so if your part of your bespoke support plan has identified that you want help to identify your intervention activities, then we can help you to work on this. But also, it's important to remember that on our logic model days, when we come out and visit you, there will also be a section on specifying your intervention activities and pulling out those key aspects. If you haven't identified that is a key issue within your bespoke support plan, and if you can contact us, then we can go over and see whether it might be possible to try and build that in within the constraints of time that we have to provide you with support. So either it's part of your bespoke support plan or give us a call or an email and we can discuss that.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. I think it's probably time to move on to our second input in the webinar. So I'm going to move us on then to part 2, which is how to specify intervention activities. So as you begin to describe your intervention activities in more detail, so you start to spell out what needs to be done, by whom, in what order, and so on, you start to move along a continuum. So a continuum from an outline of an intervention all the way up to a detailed manual that explains the intervention in more detail. So if developing an outline using the framework Vicky described in part 1 is the first step, the second step is to elaborate in much greater detail all of the key components you have described in the outline. So if we use one of Vicky's examples to illustrate this point, so she talked about a visit to the dentist. She outlined the service given by the dentist as a one-to-one appointment, during which an hour is spent giving a filling, and then the recipient receives a leaflet about how to brush their teeth properly. So in order to develop content for a manual or a handbook, we would need to describe each of those components in greater detail. We would want to spell out exactly what the information leaflet says. Does it, for example, tell the patient about the nature of gum disease, who is most at risk of developing gum disease, and also the actions that we could take to prevent getting it. That might involve eating fewer snacks and more regular brushing and so on. So we really want to spell out in greater detail the process for getting a filling. Questions we might ask ourselves include, does the filling require an injection beforehand? What substance does it consist of? And how much drilling is needed? Let's also extend this thinking to the parenting programme that Vicky described earlier. So the programme involves training parents on 3 core topics: how to play with their children, how to praise and reward good behaviour, and finally, how to discipline and manage poor behaviour. Each of the topics needs to be elaborated on in more detail in the manual, setting out the key messages to be conveyed, the skills to be demonstrated and practiced by parents, and very concretely how all of this will be delivered. So, for example, through the use of videos or role plays, discussions, notes and homework, and so on. Some interventions are simple in the sense that they really only involve one component or technology. An example of that would be an advice service. But many interventions in our field involve several components. They are more complex. In medicine, the difference between a simple and complex intervention is the difference between a simple pill you take for headaches and a complex treatment for a chronic condition that involves surgery and perhaps radiation therapy. If your intervention for children or young people is complex and has multiple components, you need to make sure that each one is clearly specified. For example, if it involves providing a mixture of residential trips, mentoring, and parenting groups, you need to set out detail on exactly what happens in each one. You also need to consider what the goals of each component are. This means asking yourself whether the activity will achieve what it needs to achieve in order to improve outcomes. In other words, whether it will adequately address the relevant risk and protective factors or circumstances that your intervention targets. Basically, the question is, will it do its job? It is therefore essential, as you're specifying and documenting intervention activities, to keep referring back to your logic model or theory of change. Your logic model sets out very clearly the outcomes you want to achieve for children, the things you need to change, reduce, or promote to achieve those outcomes, and then the key components or active ingredients of your intervention. It's good if the logic model prompts you to question whether particular intervention activities are really suitable, whether they need modifying. That process is likely to result in a stronger intervention that has a much better chance of achieving the desired outcomes for the children you serve. Let's say, for example, that you're getting some young people to work together in a group on a project to improve their interpersonal and communication skills. You propose that one will lead to the other because the young people will learn that they can only finish their project if they talk to one another respectfully, listen carefully, and recognise and encourage one another's skills. But you may consider, on reflection, that the group activity needs to be more structured if it is to achieve that goal, or that it needs to be accompanied by some basic training for the children in the skills that are targeted. Perhaps it needs to be longer, several weeks rather than several days, or it could be that it needs to be facilitated by an observer who provides regular feedback and encouragement to the individuals and the group as a whole. Another important thing to bear in mind when specifying intervention activities is to consider the order in which they happen. There are usually always some things that have to happen before others. In the case of a parenting intervention, for example, it might be argued that sessions on play and praise need to come before sessions on discipline and managing tantrums. And that's because the sessions on the play and praise help parents to build a warmer relationship with their children and create a context in which children are criticised less often. Similarly, in a school-based social emotional learning program that helps children to understand better how they feel and learn how to manage their emotions, the earlier content arguably needs to cover basic feelings like happy and sad before moving on to advanced feelings such as frustrated or jealous. The success of any intervention will only be repeated if the things that make the intervention work are delivered. In order to have the best chance of improving outcomes for children or their families, the intervention should be replicated consistently and with fidelity to the model. Fidelity to the model means that the intervention is delivered as designed and that the core components as set out in the logic model or theory of change are adhered to. In order to achieve this, you need to be clear in a manual or a handbook about what the intervention comprises and how it is to be delivered, so that the people delivering the intervention know what to deliver. At the same time, it needs to be acknowledged that the widespread rollout or scaling of a successful intervention requires adaptation, the ability for it to mould to fit with local contexts. The best scaled products in the world depend on their ability to be adapted by users, and success therefore demands not only fidelity, but also a degree of versatility. Once you have specified the detail of each component of your intervention, a vital next step then is to develop a clear explanation of what is core and therefore not to be tampered with, and what is peripheral and therefore adaptable. The humble bicycle offers a good analogy. Take away something to sit on, the wheels and a chain, and you don't have a bike. Keep those in place, and you could do lots of things and still call it a bike. To relate this back to our field, a therapeutic intervention might require that certain themes are covered in a particular order with a family, but offer some flexibility in terms of the length or setting for the sessions. Or a school-based curriculum may ask teachers to convey accurately the key messages in each lesson, but encourage them to supplement stories and examples in the materials with relevant real-life events that happen in their classroom or playground. In developing your intervention, you need to find the fertile ground between fidelity and adaptability, setting out what is essential to impact and therefore unchangeable, and establishing adaptations that will promote the wide take-up of the intervention. It is worth saying that people involved in delivering the intervention will naturally fiddle with it anyway, and they are much more likely to follow your instructions not to tinker with A, B, or C if in the same breath you give them permission to adjust D, E, or F. The key is to be clear about what can and cannot be changed and why. It might also be possible to outline optional components that do not influence the final outcome but allow local agents to make the innovation their own. The smartphone offers another good metaphor. The electronics are essential and practically impossible to change, whereas the applications or apps can be changed to meet users' personal preferences. My smartphone is like Vicky's in terms of its inner workings, but when you see its screen, it's clearly mine and not hers. And people love smartphones because of this very flexibility and adaptability. The flexibility we've talked about so far is usually described as surface adaptation. These kinds of adaptations are made for a range of different reasons. For example, we might adapt program materials to make the language used more suitable for the target population, or translate materials into other languages. We might also make adaptations to take culture into consideration, perhaps to make stories and examples more meaningful. Other service adaptations might be designed to help the intervention meet system requirements, such as reducing the length of time between sessions in order to complete the full intervention within a school term. Deep adaptations are much more radical. They would normally only be made or permitted if the nature of the problem to be addressed is considered to vary significantly from that which the intervention is designed to address. Put another way, deep adaptations only make sense if the logic model or theory of change underpinning the intervention is fundamentally challenged. An example of this would be if it could be demonstrated that conduct problems experienced by some young children were not caused, at least in part, by inconsistent parenting. This would make delivering a program focused on reducing inconsistent parenting of little value in the effort to reduce those children's conduct problems. It is akin to ripping the back off a smartphone and reprogramming it. So, having found the fertile ground between fidelity and flexibility, you will need to work out a protocol or simple checklist that practitioners, supervisors, or managers can use to ensure that the core elements are delivered as intended. Another webinar in this series will look at the nature of the fidelity data that should be collected and the means of recording and using it. Just as referring back to the logic model and refining the intervention activities helps to strengthen the intervention, so the task of having to translate the intervention into a fidelity checklist helps make sure that the components are as clearly specified as possible. If you find this hard to do, you probably aren't as clear as you need to be about activities, their content length, and so on. So we've reached the end of part 2. I'm hoping that there have been some good questions that have come in whilst we've been doing the presentation. So I'm going to hand over to Vic, who's been fielding them for me.
Okay, so yeah, we've had a few questions, and actually there's been a few on manuals. So what I'm going to go and try and do is to paraphrase them into one question for Sarah. So you've talked a lot about manuals. How do you go about writing one of those? And also linked to that, we are implementing an evidence-based program which comes with its own intervention manual. What do we need to do, if anything?
Okay, so I guess there's two parts to that question. The first would be how do we write a manual? And the second would be if we're implementing an evidence-based program and there already is a good program manual, do we need to do anything? So the first part, in terms of writing a manual, we've developed some really good guidance on that. If you haven't seen it already, our very first webinar, which is available on www.dartington.org.uk, covers in detail the kind of value and purpose of developing manuals and implementation handbooks, and gives you an idea of a process for going about writing those. So it makes a distinction between program manuals that sets out the real detail and content of the intervention, probably most closely to what we've been describing today. So the real nuts and bolts of the intervention, and implementation handbooks, which are more handbooks that detail the nuts and bolts of how a program or service is being replicated in a particular site. So if you're replicating an evidence-based program, you detail in your handbook who's delivering it, how much it's costing, what the context is, and most importantly, any adaptations that you've made. So in order to answer the questions, I first will point you towards our webinar to look at how to write manuals, and then to get in touch with your lead at SRU on the intervention support. We have some additional materials we can send you, and we're also able to kind of comment on manuals and give some good feedback. Some of the projects in the portfolio have already begun to develop their own manuals, and there are some really good examples evolving. So we may be able to kind of hook you up with other projects so you can look at those. For those of you implementing evidence-based programs, obviously you don't need to go about setting out in detail what the intervention components are, because they're usually already documented in extensive program manuals, but we would really encourage you to develop implementation handbooks and to in there document any changes that you've made to the program, any adaptations that have been made, so that if somebody was to pick up your project and replicate it somewhere else, they've got a really good tool to guide them. So hopefully that answers those questions, and I will pass back to Vicky.
Okay, that's great. So we have a fidelity question here. It says, in the last part of your presentation, you referred to fidelity checklists, and how do we develop these?
Okay, so fidelity is quite a complex issue, and we are actually going to be dedicating a whole webinar to the topic of fidelity. That one's coming up in a couple of months' time. And so it's important to say that fidelity isn't just one thing. It can be broken down into lots of different elements. And so it's important to try and consider as many of those as possible. But the first step is to know exactly what the core components of your intervention are. So not just the core active ingredients that are part of your logic model that sets out how your intervention has its impact, but also some of the other elements of your program. So we know what to prioritise when we develop ways of measuring whether or not the program is being delivered with fidelity. And you'll need to think through, what kind of data do you need to gather? Who's best placed to gather that data? Is it the people delivering the program, the people managing the implementation, or somebody independent? And you need to think about, if you're going to monitor and measure information on fidelity or develop a checklist, what you can do with that data. We would always say, if you're going to collect data, you need to use it for something. And if you're monitoring fidelity, the idea would be that you use that data and feed it back to people delivering the program to improve practice. So you boost their confidence in areas where they're doing well, so that they continue in a similar vein, or you highlight areas where they're a little weaker and where they may need some kind of top-up training, advice, or kind of coaching and assistance. Fidelity is developing fidelity tools is one very consistent theme across the large majority of projects in the Realising Ambition portfolio. Many of you will have it as an element of your bespoke support plan. So you should feel free to get in touch with us when you're ready to start looking at fidelity, and keep an eye out for that webinar that's coming up in a couple of months' time as well.